Welcome to Going in Blind. I'm your host, Zach Tidwell, and my guest this week is an associate professor of law and sociologist at Fordham University in New York. She is here today to talk about her new book, Disclosureland. She took some time to really delve into the disparity between what corporations push out in messaging and the actual actions that follow up with that. She's analyzed certain points in time in the recent past, but I think we're also starting to see some parallels, or I guess a new iteration or parallels and a new iteration of that today. So I'm very excited to get into it. You guys have heard my normal spiel of announcements. Head over to the website, zactodal.com. You join the mailing list there. And if you've been listening for a while and haven't already, please leave a rating and a review for the show. And if you prefer listening or watching your podcasts, head on over to YouTube and you can check us out there. But without any further ado, Miss Atinuke Adediran, thank you for coming on.
Thank you so much for having me, Zach. It's such a pleasure.
Yeah, this is I think you definitely win the award for the coolest name that's been on the podcast yet. And we're also this is new territory for you doing a video podcast, so that's exciting. But do, do you, before we roll into this here, I'm very curious. I didn't want to misspeak on your behalf. Can you tell everyone a little bit more about your professional background and maybe set the stage for us into what led to you taking on Disclosureland?
Yeah, so I am, as you said, I am an associate professor of law at Fordham University School of Law in New York City. And I am trained as both a legal scholar. So I have a J.D., which is a Doctor of Jurisprudence from law school, and also a Ph.D. In sociology. So I have many, many years of education. And that sort of dual degree allows me to think about the implications of a law itself in terms of law as on the books and law as an institution on people and society and sort of underground impacts, if you will. And so that combination is what brought me to Disclosureland, which the full title, for those who don't know, is Disclosureland: How Corporate Words Constrain Racial Progress. It's a little bit of a mouthful, but essentially it's about how corporations use public statements, words, to really impact how we as society think about racial equity. And I came to the book because I was really fascinated as a sociologist um, eh, with how, George Floyd was murdered, and then we had all these institutions, including companies, began to basically put out words, a lot of public statements right after they felt like they had to say something about what they were going to do in terms of racial inequality in their business or in society in general. And so I just watched as that went from just a handful of companies to hundreds and then thousands of them. Almost it seemed like overnight. And then, as a legal scholar, sitting, watching all of this, I also was fascinated about what law might say about this. Like, right? Is this even legal? How should, and if it is, how might law impact what's happening as we're watching it at that time, or as we were watching it at that time? And I had, other questions that were legal in nature, but it was basically that confluence of who I am as a researcher, as an academic, that brought me to the book.
Have you always been in academia?
No, because it takes time to become an academic, at least the way I have done it.
Well, yeah.
I was a lawyer. I was an attorney first. So I went to law school, became a lawyer. I represented companies, believe it or not. I was in a big law firm and I was a litigator and I represented companies. So it's actually great to sort of have that background and to be able to be an advocate for companies first, and then really think about what they're doing on the back end now.
So
So
you're
that's
kind
right
of
now.
both.
I'm what?
I said, so you're a turncoat. You've traded to the other
I'm
side.
traded.
Yeah.
Yes. Well, I don't know. I don't know. Not necessarily because,
Yeah.
there are also times that I do write for and in support of what companies are doing. So it's not necessarily all critical. Although, because I am a sociologist, I think about that implications of what companies do on us as society.
Yeah, I was just teasing, but what was that shift like into teaching? Are you still practicing law as well?
Not at all.
Okay.
I am fully an academic. After many years in graduate school and getting a PhD, I was not gonna go back to the practice of law. But although I did enjoy it when I did it.
That's cool. So, you mentioned as you started to notice this, you said a very particular, I guess, phrase, and I might misquote you a little bit here, but you said something to the effect of this, noticing that these companies felt like they needed to say something in terms of this, starting when this messaging started kind of coming out, I guess, surrounding racial inequalities from these companies. Have you stopped and thought like where, I guess on one hand, was that intentional language and like that almost like the ers that they had? And then have you stopped and maybe thought about where that came from? Like what was because of where I expect this to go, given that you wrote the book, what like do you think it was something with the best of intentions in the beginning, or that these were just empty kind of, hey, we need to say something about this because it's in the zeitgeist?
Yeah, so I mean, the book gets into this quite a bit. Ultimately, it was really preservation of their reputations. So there were a lot of constituents that were pressuring them to say something. And I mean those constituents wanted them to do something, but the way they responded was by saying things. So customers are a big one. Employees internally were putting pressure on their employers, these companies to do something, but then that sort of came out as words. Um, Shareholders, believe it or not, investors wanted, and in fact, most of the change that did happen came from investors' pressure to say something. The media was also part of the mix of constituents that were pushing.
Always.
Always, right? We have to add that. And and we can get into this if you're if you're interested. But also we had a shift. So there's President Trump was in office when this happened, and then there was a shift to President Biden, and that also puts a different pressure along those lines from a political standpoint. And now we're back to President Trump. Anyways, all of those things also were involved in putting pressure on these corporations.
Yeah, and we can go wherever you want with this. I'm trying to prod you to pull information from you to dive into all this. So whatever comes up, we can go there. But it's, I guess I have a hard time. Yes, George Floyd was murdered and that was horrible. But then I have a hard time connecting that to these companies doing it. It seems like I guess that to say that, use the same word that I used earlier, is kind of knee jerk, where like I don't know. I guess in what way did you see this start to be addressed, given that that started with an act of violence against a man? This guy was a police officer, abused his power and murdered a man. And then how was that coming out? How did you see this being expressed by all of these constituents that you talked about? And how did you dig into all that in researching for this book?
Yeah, so essentially, George Floyd was murdered. We're in like May, right, 2020.
Mhm.
All of a sudden, there was like this major, major national, right, attention to this issue. Lots of protests, lots of, people on the streets, not just in the US, but also abroad. We had, in Europe, we had in Africa, we had in Asia, people protesting this, act of violence, as you called it. And so, um, we should think that society is constituted by a lot of institutions, right? And so, of course, we have the public institutions. We had, actual police departments that really also were pressured, right? But then we had universities. So I'm talking about nonprofits. We had um, uh, corporations. We had all these other institutions where customers are connected to them, employees, some of whom were on the streets themselves, right? You have customers on the street and going on social media and saying, oh, this company X, Y, and Z has not done anything regarding this racial inequality that plagues the firm, or employees on the street protesting or on social media saying these things, right? We had investors, and we can get into that because this is an important part of the book. Investors asking companies to look into actual racial inequality or bias that they've seen or that they think is there, asking them to do what are called racial equity audits. A racial equity audit is basically conducted by a third party. It would be like a third party firm would come in and look into a company's operations, its books, its structures, and try to figure out if there is racial inequality or bias or even discrimination somewhere in there. So these investors began to ask for that. And that sort of came a year or two into all of the statements the companies themselves were making. But you can imagine investors calling up and saying, oh, we've been investing in this company. Like, so what are you going to do now about this problem? Or an employee is doing that. So all that pressure sort of came because it seems like there's this act of violence, which is in the public sector, right? You have police department. What does that have to do with these private firms? But the pressure impacted all of these institutions. It wasn't just private firms, even universities, right? Universities also felt like they had to step up, and many of them began to look at their history connections with slavery or how their students might have been impacted by histories of racial discrimination. So it was widespread national reckoning, and I'm putting it in quotes, at the time because everyone was sort of in on it.
I don't know. I don't every I and I'm disagreeing for the sake of discussion here, and I'm just this is I don't think everyone was, and I think it was a loud minority. And I guess what I was trying to get at was there was, and I think you kind of painted this picture as well. Like I think there was almost this. I mean, it was like an activism kind of bubbling up through everything, and I guess, I have a hard time with DEI. I had a hard time with it even as a disabled man. Like I had a hard time with it. I'm a big believer in meritocracy. That's how I was raised, and coming up playing sports. The military is very much so a meritocracy, and I believe that is where kind of what the world should run on, and that we should, in terms of establishing equity, should be in maybe fixing communities that are horrendous places to grow up, as opposed to coming in, and especially when you get the secondary companies like you talked about that are coming in to do these racial equity audits. I think there was a lot of grifting that went on during this time. Some of that stuff, yes, there were people and individuals with really good intentions that were making these pushes, but then you had other entities coming in being like, oh, this is a cash grab, let's start doing racial audits for these, or offering racial audits to these other companies and stuff like that. But I guess what I'm trying to get at here, and I was trying to lay out just so you know where I'm at, where I'm also coming from with these questions, or so you know where I'm coming out or coming from with these questions, is did you see a direct tie, I guess, or was this just downstream of George Floyd's murder, or was it a direct tie that, because you mentioned it being, even a year or two after that all this started happening, because that's tying those two events together, a murder to that movement starting to bubble up even in the investor base is interesting to me.
Yeah, I mean, it was directly tied. So, it's basically uh there was very little. In fact, I would say it was rare for companies to make public statements about racial equity before George Floyd. Rare
Like at all?
at all.
Okay.
What we had before that was non-discrimination statements. So you might remember things like we do not discriminate on the basis of race, gender, right, sexuality, like those
Basic kind of stuff.
basic, right?
Yeah.
And race would just be one of the lists. It would just be this laundry list of things, and they would slap it on everything. That's what we had before. It was rare for really any company to want to say anything about race. George Floyd brought it up, and I have, the book has actual graphs to show this upward move that is quite jarring, actually. You just see nothing, and then all of a sudden it's like, it takes a year to really see, but 2021 it goes up and it just keeps going up,
Yeah.
keeps going up. It keeps going up, even until 2024. And the book really shows that trajectory, really to sort of get at this question, right, as well, which is what brought this on? Why do we have this? And what sort of triggered this in this way, because it's systematic, it's extensive, it's thousands of companies at the same time, and many of them are not even publicly traded. They were private companies. Private companies, they don't have shareholders. I've been talking about shareholders a lot. They don't have investors. They're just owned by like two people, right? They don't need to say anything, but they did as well. And that tells you that there was something about that moment and the pressure. And even if you don't have shareholders, there's a pressure that sort of took everyone, along, even if they didn't mean it, right? Then we could talk about that. There were many companies that didn't mean it. They just felt like they had to do it to preserve their reputation. And that's what we sort of saw over time.
Yeah. How did you go about gathering this data to make the graphs? And then I want to dig into, all these other things that you've touched on, but I'm very curious. That seems like just gargantuan undertaking.
It was, and I started writing this book in 2021. The world was very different at the time. So, and I just traced the data over time, and it basically involved thousands and hundreds of thousands of texts, um and going through and using software to categorize and figure out who was saying what and when and how. And the data involves over 2,300 companies, all of whom are Russell 3000. So for those who don't know what that is, Russell 3000 companies are basically some of the largest companies in the US. And they are categorized as large cap, mid cap, and small cap, but even the small cap are large, and they're quite big. And I limited my research to the largest companies because they're more likely to essentially have some sort of stake in sort of a reputational story, and more likely to want to say something. In addition to that, it includes private companies. So I looked at basically the largest 200 companies in the U.S. That don't have investors or they're not publicly traded. They may have investors, but they're private. And they too mirror what I saw with the publicly traded companies.
Well, I was just about to ask, what differences did you see? That's really interesting.
It is. It
Uh,
is.
What do you think that was?
Again, this is ultimately, even if you don't have investors, you have customers, right? You have consumers of your goods and services if you're not or like a retail company. Um, you also have employees. So whether or not you're publicly traded, you have employees internally. who are also saying, well, all this time, we've been telling you, and these are actual conversations I had. Also, I did interviews with chief diversity officers in some of these companies, private and public, and also chief sustainability officers. And they would say something like, over time, some of these employees have been telling the company, these are some of the issues that we face. But all of a sudden, George Floyd sort of allowed them to see it. It wasn't like internal, but to see sort of societal, larger impacts of that, and they were paying attention for the first time, or they were listening for the first time. And that happened whether you were a public traded company or private
Yeah.
firm.
Were so it was the CDO, the chief diversity officer, and the chief societal officer. Is that what you said?
Chief sustainability officers. So
A
those
sustainability. Okay.
sustainability, yes.
Um, where I guess I could see where the chief sustainability officer would have existed already, but the CDO is that a role that arose out of this time period, or did that exist already? Commonly in big companies.
They existed
Okay.
before, but they certainly increased at this time. So there were more of them hired between 2020 and I would say 2024 than before.
Okay. So did you do any, or were you able to capture this data, or did you, look into it at all in terms of analyzing, especially with the publicly traded companies, since you could see their reporting every quarter, if there were, I guess, if their profit margins or their gross capital that they made each quarter changed in line with whether or not they were making these statements?
I mean, you were asking whether, there was like a business case for this. Like, did he help you? It's hard to do that when every company did it, right? So if we had a situation, and when I say every company, 98% of them did it.
Oh my gosh.
Yes. So it's not like one could isolate. And I looked at the ones that didn't, and we can talk about those. There are very few of them, a handful. And I dig deeper. I wanted to know, who are these companies that chose not to say anything about anything? Uh, Most of them were smaller. So I talked about the Russell 3000, and we had the small cap. Most of them were smaller. Most of them were located in the South, meaning their headquarters was in the South or in the Midwest of the United States. And most of them were not uh did not have customers who are like they're not public facing. They don't have, so they're not like retail, right?
Yeah.
They're less likely to have uh uh, customers directly, with them or talking to them or having any interaction. So that's sort of the profile of the handful of companies that chose not to say anything at all about this. But there's so few of them.
Well, once you said that they're down in the South, that made sense. Like that checked out like immediately when you said that. I thought that's just kind of a funny little anecdote. So there's so many directions to go in here. What do you feel is the most appropriate to go? I don't want to
Wherever
make you
way.
skip stuff.
No, not at all. This is great. We can keep going through
Okay.
whatever comes to mind for you.
Okay. So I guess, I mean, I felt like you emphasized the role of investors here, like a couple times as you were talking about the different constituencies of these companies, and I guess probably also a large part of that is the fact that you analyze the some of the biggest companies in the world, which are vastly public. Or I guess if they are on that scale, they are public. So what? Because I felt like there was so much emphasis on that. Why the emphasis, and why in particular is that something that seems to have kind of caught your eye?
Yeah, that's a really good observation. So investors are probably the most powerful constituent that companies that are publicly traded have. And you can imagine that's intuitive, right? They invest, put money into the company, and their shareholders, they're dispersed, and companies may feel a need to respond to them. I think much more than others. They're also more likely to have be able to directly reach out to the CEO, the C-suite, especially if they are institutional shareholders. So institutional shareholders themselves are companies. So like BlackRock or Vanguard, right? Those are companies too, but they're shareholders. And so they can call up, the CEO of probably any company in the US and make demands. And so that's sort of the profile. But more than that, there are legal levers that allow shareholders to intervene in what a company does. And one of those is through the shareholder proposal. You probably have seen this in the news lately when we had the Target Costco debacle. As a reminder, essentially, we had shareholders submit proposals to these companies. And the goal of that is for other shareholders to vote on those proposals. So if I was a shareholder and I was investing in a company, I can basically, if there's something I would like the company to change, or if there's some information that I need about a particular issue, I can submit a proposal to the company, and the goal of that is for other shareholders to be able to vote on it. And the company is required by law to actually provide other shareholders with that proposal so they can see what it is about and decide for themselves how they would like to vote. So that legal instrument allows shareholders more than any other constituent to intervene in a broad way, because then other shareholders can see what the issue is. And because of that, when George Floyd was murdered, and post that, shareholders used this legal lever quite a bit. And what they would do is, either, they would ask for things like a racial equity audit, and the audit doesn't change anything. They just want to know, like, let's find out if there's more in here. There's a problem that we're seeing, and we'd like you to answer some of these questions. And that would be one way. There are other things. Or if we see a pay gap issue, like we know anecdotally that there are issues, it could even be gender, women are paid less in your company. Can you look into this, or provide information on that? And they can use the proposal system to get at that. Now, it is right now, and I feel a need to say that shareholder proposals are uh, 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 a little bit under attack by the current administration because of the sort of way in which they can be used, right? I say under attack, and I don't literally mean that. I mean that there is a potential to try to push back on them right now. And that makes sense in terms of um, you can imagine, the SEC regulates, so the Securities and Exchange Commission regulates companies, and it's through that process that you can use a proposal. And state laws, so Delaware law can also say this is how proposals can be used, or this is how they cannot be used. So all of these different legal uh, uh, all of these different ways are allowing basically some pushback on how proposals are being used. But that's generally how they were used, or how they've been used.
Yeah, I had no idea that was a thing, but I also didn't know in terms of the shareholder proposals, but also that it broke down even to a state level. Like it is so, and I guess that's probably dictated by where the business's headquarters is at, or where it's
Yes.
registered at.
That's right. And every state would have their own. So most of corporate law is basically state law in the US. So every state, and some of your listeners may or may not know this, but Delaware is where most companies are incorporated right now in the US. But a lot of companies are moving their business to Texas, for example. So
Mhm.
Texas business law is actually growing a lot more than it has ever been. Nevada is another place where companies are moving their businesses to. But for the most part, most companies are incorporated in Delaware. And so Delaware governs a lot of what they do, including whether or not shareholders can bring proposals, in what ways, etc.
Wow. I guess with what you've seen, on one hand, I'm curious to know because this came to mind when you were breaking down the institutional shareholders versus individuals and things like that. Like, if there's certain, I guess, one, did you see a delineation between if it's institutional investors versus, an amassed group of individuals making these big pushes via these shareholder proposals, I guess, in more of that activism movement. And I'm curious because that if it's the institutional investors, they could also then be almost making their own public statements by saying we are only investing in companies that pass these, X racial equity audits. Therefore, also like, they're compounding that messaging, even though they don't really care what's going on.
Well, maybe they do care, right?
Yeah.
Maybe they do, but yes, it's actually mostly institutional shareholders, and
Mm.
the reason for that also is you can imagine, perhaps you and I invest in a company, but we don't have a lot of power to call up the CEO and try to get some of the and so let me backtrack. Most of the time, when shareholders have an issue they want to press the company that they're invested in on, is first they use informal channels. So you literally call the CEO or the managers or and no, seriously, and you say, here's what we're thinking and here's what we would like. And many times it ends there. They don't go through the proposal process. They get what they want and it's gone.
It's
And
just like lobbying in the government.
exactly. So that happens here too, right?
Wow.
It's gone and we never hear of it. And you can imagine you and I probably don't have that kind of power to do that. So most of the shareholders pushing for this are institutions, and so they can do that. Now, if the company says no, where it doesn't work out informally, that's when you have the sort of formal proposal process going through. And even then, sometimes they submit a proposal, and then the company calls them up, and then it's withdrawn. There's a lot of proposals that are withdrawn that don't go through the shareholder votes at all.
That is so screwy. How legal is all this? You're a law professor.
Yeah, it actually is legal. I mean, or at least there's nothing saying it's illegal.
Wow.
Right? Yeah, and so there's a lot of which, and the book explains this, kind of lays it out. And okay, so if let's say it's not withdrawn, they still don't agree with you. That's when you then ask other shareholders, look, would like you to vote on this, and the board would make a recommendation to other shareholders. And the book talks about and I think this is problematic where companies are making a lot of commitments, public commitments, but then they would ask the shareholders to vote against the proposals that are supposed to be addressing racial inequality issues.
So that they can, they do their virtue signaling, but they don't actually have to take action.
That's right. And I think that's perfectly fine if you're not publicly saying the opposite.
Yeah.
It's
Yeah,
just
that is that disingenuous, I I- it's whether you agree with the whatever the issue be, any sort of issue you want to pick like this, and whether it be through these corporations or politically, there's a big, I think a lot of the gross behavior all kind of stems out of abstracting responsibility away from the individual because again, the corporate entity is recognized by the law as a person. So there's no actual individual that is responsible for anything that happens. And I get on this level, this is when they're doing this, when they are publicly saying something and then internally asking shareholders to vote against it. I mean, that seems like a very gray area where you're almost along the lines of false advertising from a legality perspective. Is that the case?
I mean, that's a interesting way to couch it. I mean, I wouldn't call it false advertising from a legal for being very technical here.
Okay.
Um, because what they would do is this. So, imagine this company putting out a lot of, we will, try to hire more people of color, right? This racial targets, for example. That's what the book calls them. We will try to hire more people of color by a certain period. Let's say that's what they put out. And then the shareholders say, oh, that's great because we see there's this other problem that we think you should focus on. There is this community of color, for example, where your trucks like drive through, like 90% of the trucks are going through that neighborhood. And this is causing like environmental issues for them, like it's causing like people to get sick, etc. And the company would say, well, we already said we're going to hire people, so we don't need to look into that. Now, the issue that the shareholders are bringing up has nothing to do with the public statements they made, right? Technically. But they're basically equating, like, we've already talked to you, we've already told you publicly that we care about equity issues. So we don't need to address any of the problems.
Whoa.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's like hey, we're dealing with it already because we said we are.
We said we are. So just let it go. And a lot of the proposals would die based on that pushback.
And again, these are the trends that you saw across 98% of these companies, both public and private.
Of the ones that then sort of used the statements so there were like about 100 who would then and obviously we have a cutoff in time, right? So, and the book sort of lays out what we're seeing, like the 2020 through 2023, right? Like the hotbed, and then the 2023 to 2020, and I say 2023 because we had students for fair admissions be Harvard. That's the case that invalidated the use of race in admissions. And that case had a little bit of an impact. So I as a timeline issue, and we can talk about what that means really, 2023. And then we have the 2023 to 2024, I would say the beginning of 2024, and then end of 2024 to the present, right? So all of those frames also like differ in terms of what was going on.
Okay. Yeah, and I mean that's the Harvard case that you're talking about is basically where Asian students, because they were so successful for a while, were being discriminated against, and then were not being held to the same standards as everyone else getting into Harvard, correct?
I mean, I disagree with how you frame that. I would say Asian students brought this case to say that they were discriminated against because they were not being admitted into Harvard based purely on their numbers, right? In terms of like their metrics, right? So, you have the SAT score and the GPA, right? Just playing on that. The problem is you cannot constitute a university based on numbers alone, right? You have to think about the whole person. You want to think about geographical diversity, for example. You want to have some students from the South and some from the Midwest and some from the Northeast and some from wherever, international, just to have a more robust, interesting learning environment for the students, right? And so universities, as I think they must consider all of these things, right? And race was just one of them, right? There are other things they do consider. If they just like went on numbers alone, it would be quite an interesting group of students, in my opinion. And so they don't want that, right? And I think it makes sense for them to consider that. But anyway, the lawsuit was about, if we look at the numbers alone, then we should have been admitted probably a lot more than we have.
And that, again, that would be meritocracy versus equity.
I don't know that. I think
Okay.
I think it's meritocracy to also consider geographical diversity. All right. I think it's important to think about that as well, because it's not just about the exam, right? That's not what makes a college great, in my opinion.
Or
It's
even a professional or a student.
or a
Yeah.
professional student. We want to have people from the South tell us what that experience was about as we're learning in the classroom. I think that's important. We just don't want to have just one group of people constitute a learning environment. I think that's really important.
Yeah, that's a great point. And honestly, I'm glad that this came up because I've never thought of it from that perspective. And that's a great point. I've always, I guess, even I think you probably picked up on it in the way that you disagreed with how I phrased, I guess, my perception of that case, or, it's very surface level, like reading that I've done on it, but that I've come at it more, I guess, from a even, yeah, very surface level, just in general, from not having considered it from even, I guess that's very pertinent here. I think in an educational institution, like that makes sense too, from this whole country is a melting pot. Like, so if you almost let that filter out of the educational institutions, I could see how that could stifle growth. I don't know. It's,
Uh,
go ahead.
it's really, I mean, we could do we could do a thought experiment. If you just have the numbers and we have just 90% of the students at Harvard be from one country, because somehow all of them could get high SAT scores, or
Mhm.
what. I don't know if that's the best learning environment, versus looking across the country and saying, yeah, sure, this kid from Texas doesn't have the highest numbers, but he or she can bring something into this university that other people do. This kid from the inner cities has a lot of resilience. They've gone through a lot of hardships in their lives. Let's bring them on because they can contribute something to this university and the learning environment. This kid, right? Like, really think through about all of those things. Now, I'm not saying they're not also smart. Of course they are, but
Yeah.
they may not have, right? If we're just like lining up all the numbers, they may not be at the highest level, but that cannot be the only thing that we think about, because I'm sitting at a university too. We have to think about all these different things, especially in college, right? So I'm not talking about professional school, or where college is supposed to be the place where you find yourself. I would hope, where you
And to
find
start to develop.
develop your
Yeah.
interests and passions in life and all of those things. And one ought to think about what each of these students bring because of their backgrounds.
Yeah. Thank you. Seriously. Like, I thank you for broadening, I guess, opening my eyes on that a little bit. I think I bet I'm gonna have to stop and think about that after we get off here. Yeah, I guess for you, I mean, you've spent so much time in school. Like, is it's why is that part of why you wanted to return to teach? I guess, I mean, you went back to school to get your PhD. So w- this was that because it was so formative for you spending, I guess, I mean, your JD had to be an ungodly amount of time at school too. So was that what made you go back?
No, not really. I wanted to get the advanced degree since I was in college. Speaking of college, and those formative years,
Yeah.
it was in college that I developed an interest in being an academic, and I knew that I would. I also wanted to be a lawyer since I was a child, but I wanted to combine. I know I wanted to combine my long awaited interest in law with this newly found in college interest in teaching. It was, and so I thought, oh, law professor. Okay, so like, how do I do that? And that sort of took many, many years of
Yeah.
education, but I got there eventually.
That is so cool. Childhood dream. What as a kid made you want to be a lawyer?
I don't know. I was in like debates, I was one of those people who, I kind of had an interest. I was a really strong writer since I was a child. I developed a love actually for writing very early on in my life. And so I also, knew that that's kind of useful if you're going to be a lawyer. And so
Yeah.
plus I saw lawyers on TV and I was like, this is great. You could be in front of a judge and like argue something. And I did debate and I liked the research, like doing research for debates. I actually like the research more than the speaking, which is interesting now. I've never thought about that, but as we're speaking, I just thought about it. Um,
Huh.
and so, yeah, so all of those things kind of point to someone who, might, of course, I could have been a writer, I suppose, but law, I think is much more in my passion, and I think just being a writer, and as a law professor, I can write. So this
So
is
and
perfect.
I'm surprised you don't like the speaking part. You're a great communicator. Like you're great at it. So it's interesting.
I do now, but at the time as a child, I had a little bit of anxiety speaking in public, but now I
Yeah.
do it all the time. I'm a professor. I'm in front of the classroom. And I've gained some confidence over time, for sure.
Yeah. That's awesome. I mean, I feel like because I derailed us, I need to bring us back on course a little bit here because I want to get into, I feel and if you feel like we've missed anything to kind of set the stage here in what was going on, please tell me and we'll cover that. But I want to look at the other side of this, and your book is also covers the legal implications of all of this. So I guess on one hand, were there precedents for this in the past that you're basing whatever you present in the book, or how does all this lay out?
Yeah, so legal implications is a little bit complicated because there's so many different things going on, and the sort of the way law intersects with them is also different. Um, so there was never, as I said, this is sort of extensive, sort of uh, extensive and strategic putting out statements about race. It was new in 2020. There was but the putting statements about race is also broad, and the book talks about what the different types of statements are. So we've been talking about just words, but what are they saying, right? And the book breaks them down. There are general statements, things like, we will do better in terms of racial equity. That's just an example. There are statements that are racial targets. Racial targets are not quotas. And as I've specifically, in the book specifically talks about, and I have an article specifically about this, they are legal because they are not quotas. If they were quotas, they will be illegal in the US, but because they are. And what racial targets are goals or aspirations to hire or promote people of color over a period of time.
Mhm.
The book also talks about what it calls corporate racial philanthropy. Corporate racial philanthropy are basically statements or commitments related to philanthropy on race. So either and it's complicated than that because it's really about a transactional way of thinking about race and philanthropy, that companies treated philanthropy related to race differently than traditional philanthropy. So instead of grant making, they would do things like loans or um, uh, things like uh, uh, um, diversity programs that are supposed to uh, help minority-owned businesses, but they will call that philanthropy, right? Even though it's a business. Um, so the book talks about that as well. And there are also statistics. So there's a lot of that. Statistics about demographics, statistics about current demographics, uh, 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 talked about racial targets, which is future, but current demographics. Here's our numbers just today. And by the way, companies have to disclose that anyway to the EEOC.
Oh, okay.
But it's not public. So the EEOC normally receives that. It's called a EO1 form, and companies will provide the demographics to the EEOC. That has always been a requirement for most companies in the US, even those that are much smaller than these ones that I'm looking at. But they started to make them public, right, on their own accord. So the book also talks about that sort of stuff. So all of these different statements, all of the different public commitments were being made, and they all have their own legal, right, implications. And if you like, I can sort of go through them quickly, but each
Sure.
of them. So general statements are what they are. They're just like, oh, we're gonna do this. They're fluffy. It's really hard to pin them down, right? To say this is what you intend to do or not. So they're sort of a throwaway, if you will. But for many companies, that was actually the thing that drove a lot of it looks like it made them look like they were doing so much or that they cared, right?
Yeah.
Some of the statements were impassioned, right? Like, the things like, the hurt that has happened to Black communities in this country, like we will do better, I mean, statements like that, almost like a human being is speaking. So those are general statements. From a legal standpoint, it's really hard to use them one way or the other. Okay, so let's talk about racial targets. Probably the one that has the most legal implications, and the ones that conservative groups have said are quotas. So again, these are goals or aspirations. They are not quotas at all. And the reason for that is because no one can really hold them to it. So it's more like, we hope to do something. We plan to do something potentially, but they don't have to, right? It's not like it's a requirement. Legally, quotas are required. And it's often like there is an institution kind of holding the company to it. If you look at the law around this, racial quotas have been like forced on companies, by some external force, often the government, saying, you cannot do this and you must, increase these numbers. These are voluntary goals that nobody forced anybody to say, that this company decided to put out. So these are racial targets.
And in that, even like these racial equity auditors weren't forcing those constraints on them.
So
The quotas.
so racial equity audits are different from racial targets. So racial targets are just, again, public statements that these companies are putting out to as goals, right, to try to increase the number of minorities that they hire or promote. Racial equity audits are uh, basically requests by shareholders. So investors would ask companies to engage in an audit. And an audit uh, may or may not really be done, but it's essentially go in and we want you to look at whether there is some bias or discrimination in your company. Now, notice that you don't actually have to put out the results of your audit. You could do it internally. You don't. You could do it internally and keep it internal. It doesn't have to be public.
Yeah, then say, "Oh yes, we're doing great. Look no further." Like, huh?
no, but or you could make it sort of known to shareholders that this is what we found, but not make it. What I mean is, you don't have to put it as a public statement out there the way
Okay.
you're doing with other things,
Okay.
right? It could be, okay, shareholders, we're gonna do this audit as you suggested, but we're not gonna make the results publicly known, and that would be fine too, right? But the point is that we had these shareholders asking for audit, which is separate from any statements that these companies are making on their own. And then we have the philanthropic statements. So those are, or they call them philanthropy, the corporate ratio philanthropy, are basically business transactions framed as philanthropy. And there is very little legal sort of tie into this, because, again, this is something that you're just putting out. And we can talk about some of the sort of accountability issues that the book talks about with not having any legal tie-in. So you could say that and then just take it away tomorrow, which is, we haven't even talked about retraction at all, but that's basically what has happened. And we have those. And then the demographic information, they're just facts, right? So if 20% of your employees are people of color, it's just the facts like that, right? It's just what it is right now. And there is nothing about that. Companies can make those available if they want. That's just sort of, nobody's forcing them to make. By the way, none of these are mandatory. We should have started there. None. All of these that we've been talking about are voluntary. Nobody's asking companies to put anything out there except maybe the pressures they're feeling, but there's no government entity requiring any of these things.
Okay. So do you want to step into retraction from here?
Sure.
Okay. This is so just like it's fascinating. It's yeah. So go
So,
for it.
so retraction, oh man. So, at the end of 2024 is really when we began to see that begin to happen. And I cannot get into all the sort of moves, but suffice it to say that it started first on the legal side. So there were lawsuits filed. I would say starting from 2023, but really ramping up. But also in 2024, we began to see attorneys general threaten, or actually put out, and I say their threats because they are letters threatening companies that they will come after them. And the attorneys general mostly in conservative states, what
Mm.
people might call red states. So those attorneys generals put pressure. I should say this word: attorneys general put pressure on the companies and said, we're gonna come after you, and that sort of thing. So that happened also in 2024. These sort of levers did not really make a big difference in terms of what companies did. Most of them just kind of carried on with making their public statements, and they kept it going. But at the end, once we were close to the election period, so uh, the election was in November, but campaign, and it started to look like President Trump might actually come into office. And once he came into office, we began to see what the book calls a partial retraction of these previously made disclosures about race. What that means is just a modification of language. So changing words about equity into more mundane language like inclusion or belonging, things like that. So we started to see that. And then, of course, President Trump came into office in January of 2025 and signed executive orders, basically saying DEI should, well, the executive order targeted agencies, but basically expressing that anything that one or that he might call, or maybe the conservative groups around those pushbacks might call DEI was now under threat, that's when we started to see what the book calls a complete race conscious retraction. And that is basically the erasure of some of these statements that we've talked about. So companies actually deleting what they had said they would do, or the commitments or the targets that they made, all the impassioned language being erased, all of that stuff really did not happen until 2025.
And my understanding is that those executive orders also included companies that do business with the federal government. Is that correct?
Yes, and in fact, executive orders really can only hook onto companies that do business with the federal government. So you have to be a government contractor. And the reason for that is because when you're a government contractor, you get your contracts rather from the agency, and the executive branch has control over the agencies. And so the executive branch can just say agencies do not contract with these companies anymore. If you're not a government contractor, you can really do whatever you want. However, President Trump has just generally being anti-DEI, whatever that means, which supposedly includes all of these equity issues. And so whether or not you're a government contractor, companies have felt like they had to respond to that. Um, and we can talk about that. The new EEOC under this administration has made sort of a broad. Remember, I said that companies have to give their demographics to the EEOC, and they're regulated by the EEOC if you are a certain number, and most companies are. So it's really like very small number of companies, or tiny companies are not regulated by the EEOC. So all of these companies are, and so there's also the EEOC as well, which is a federal government agency that regulates employment discrimination. That's what it does. And so
What does the acronym stand for? I meant to ask you that earlier, but there was so much to ask you about, I forgot.
the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay. And so, on one hand, all of those partial retractions were coming preemptively to the when it started looking like Trump was going to win. You already saw a traceable trend of them pulling back.
Yes.
Wow. That is just, again, it's like, and it makes you wonder too what conversations were going on behind closed doors. We already likened or drew the direct parallel from investors to lobbyists. Like it is, there has to be those same dynamics going on, and that were at play there. But so, now we've seen these things. You said, the full retractions or complete retractions are here, and I've been really curious. I listen to. I'm a software developer, and I like listening to interviews with technical founders of companies and these big tech founders. I think it's, for whatever reason, it's something that really, really piques my curiosity. And so I listen to a lot of them. I've noticed what feels to me to be a trend. It's interesting. I feel like in Silicon Valley, it was almost like an agnostic, if not just, religion was never seemed to be talked about. And then in the past at least year, I feel like I started to notice it before that, but I know for sure in the past year, I'm starting to see these founders, all of a sudden everybody's Christian. Have you noticed that?
I have not, but I'm not surprised.
Yes, it is. There's two specifically I can think of, which is interesting because now they run a prime contractor, the Palantir. Is Peter Thiel and Palmer Luckey are two just, they're tech billionaires, but now
they go to church.
yes. And I don't know, maybe this was something that they didn't talk about before because it wasn't okay to talk about in Silicon Valley. There could be that, but it's an odd thing I started to notice, and I was very curious to pick your brain on it. Cause I'm like, that's what I was talking in the intro about you. And this is like this new, I feel like this is the next iteration of the messaging, and I get it's different because it's not a corporation coming out and saying, you know what, the company's going to church on Sunday. But it's interesting that it seems like these guys who are now in the favor of the Trump administration, and those aren't the only two that I've heard talk about it and start talking about their faith publicly. But those are the two most recent ones that I can think of. And it's funny because, they're military prime contractors. But I just, now you start paying attention to it and tell me if you notice it.
Yeah, I will. And just speaking of, I mean, what the CEO says is important. And we have you may have heard of the Business Roundtable, which is basically CEOs of some of the largest companies in the US. They have what's called the Business Roundtable, and they've made major statements that have shaped, how companies across the country have thought about some of these issues. And so if you have CEOs coming out and talking about, Christianity and all of that, that is something. I wonder now if we're gonna see more of that. But it really kind of is, again, back to the reputational point. It's really about trying to make sure that they protect their reputations. And now, it's cool to be Christian. So
Uh, it's weird, and there's all sorts of theories as to what's leading it because, like, I won't drag us down that rabbit hole. Basically, I would be curious to hear from you in 6 months if you're like, you know what, I've started doing some research into this and it is happening. But
yeah, maybe I would. Maybe I would.
could be your next book. Yeah.
Yeah, no, and maybe more people now will be interested in it because it's cool to be Christian.
Yeah. And it's, nothing wrong with Christianity. I just think it's funny that all of a sudden people seem to be coming out of the woodwork when it's convenient.
Yeah.
Also, I'm going to say allegedly Peter Thiel and Palmer Luckey, please don't sue me if you don't like that. So, not criticizing, just noting that it's happening. So what else here? We've come full picture from kind of what set the stage. Have you the other? Oh, go ahead.
I want to make a point, and we haven't talked about it at all,
Mhm.
about the sort of the second part of the title of the book, which is about racial progress.
Mhm.
And one of the things that's important is to sort of, I think, talk about how I'm conceiving of that and how these words actually impact racial progress, because that's the sort of thrust of the book. So the book defines racial progress in a particular way, and it's about really thinking about the generations of racial minorities and wanting to sort of address deep-seated inequality that impacts those communities. And the way in which companies have, so come out and make commitments, again, because of the reputation, all the things that we've talked about, use those statements in a way that preserve their reputations. When shareholders will say, oh, what about this issue? And they will say, oh, actually, we've already made those statements. Retracted them when it was no longer cool to be saying these things, right? All of those things are a signal. Like there's a signal to constituents, to society, to the media about the importance of these issues. And for me, if it's not clear where my priors are, it's important to think about sort of the history of racial inequality in the United States and how our institutions have sort of uh, created actual barriers to achieving them, and to think about what these companies, or at least said they were trying to do, or why they came out of the woodworks to try to do that, and how the sort of levers in which they're strategically moving around the pieces might actually undermine that, right? So that's what the book is trying to say. Like, all of these things you're doing might actually undermine racial equity ultimately.
Okay. Can we maybe start with what some of the barriers are that you were just kind of hinting to?
Right. I mean, okay, so should we talk about wealth inequality in the US? We can start there. Minorities have significantly less wealth over time than white Americans do. So that's one. We can talk about income inequality as well. The sort of, you've probably heard of this phrase, last hired, first fired, is true across the range. There is now, I don't know if you've seen this article that came out maybe 3 weeks ago or so. The Black women now have the highest unemployment in the U.S. Right now, post Trump coming into office. And they're the most likely to be working, right? And there's this sort of significant drop in employment that it does happen. Um, so I'm just talking about sort of on the in the sort of income side. We can talk about on the education side, right? There are schools that lack resources, segregated across the country, even in New York, where minorities are more likely to go because the neighborhoods just don't have a lot of resources to pour into those educational programs for this.
Smaller tax base because of the income constraints. And so,
Exactly.
yeah.
And we can talk about how neighborhoods are segregated, and because of that, that impacts the kinds of schools that you can even go to. And those schools are under-resourced, and that impacts your educational background and impacts ultimately your income. And then we can talk about bias in the workplace, right? There's that. Let's look at the numbers. The reason why, this companies were saying we will hire and promote is because look, the CEO, the C-suite, everywhere is predominantly white. You would see more minorities in lower level, entry level positions, and the book talks about, while that's not progress, right? Yeah, sure, you can hire all these people into like entry level, really low wage positions, but you're not promoting them across the managerial positions. And that's something we as a society should look at. Why is that happening across the range? When these people are going to school and getting educated, like it's not like they don't have, some, I mean, there are, right? There is no lack of people to hire. It's just that they're not being hired. And my other work has talked about homophily, which is basically our tendency as human beings to gravitate to people we think are more like us. This is just a human thing. This is not about bias at all. It's just like, if you think about it, you walk into a party, and there are people that you think are more like you, you're more likely to gravitate toward them.
Yeah, we're tribal, very much
Yes.
so. Yeah.
It's a human thing. You know, they've often said things like, think about who is at your wedding. That's really tells you what homophily is, right? Most people would, they would say the closest people to me are people at my wedding. Like, what did they look like? Are they mostly your race, or is it a mix? And most people would say they're mostly of their race or their culture or whatever, right? So homophily also plays a role in this, right? So you come, you see a company, and the manager, the supervisor is white, and he comes from a particular place, and he thinks that he has more in common with the white guy who's younger, and he brings him on and he mentors him, and then all of a sudden this other white guy is like hired, oh, it's like promoted, right? Some of it may not be racial bias. It's just homophily that drove that. And then all of a sudden, the institution becomes, right, most likely to promote white people over time. And then that's what people say when they say institutional bias or institutional racism. It's not like one person, it's like over, it's a homophily is driving it. There's some bias. There's some people that are racist, that's true. They just flat out would not hire, certain people. But a lot of people, and I want to give human beings, I think most people are not, right? And maybe they are, but most people in general try. And so maybe they try, but it's because they feel like they can connect to this person more, but that person is more likely to be someone of their own race as well. And because over time, white Americans have had opportunities. And so minorities are just not getting up the, because of homophily sort of keeps them down too, including bias as well.
Yeah, that's the first time that I've ever heard of that term. So it's interesting. But it's, again, and I agree with you. I think vastly, most people are good. Most people are trying to operate, doing the right thing. And it's, a lot of it, if that does occurs, I would find it hard to believe is intentional. There are shitty people that do that kind of stuff intentionally, but it's again, I feel like in even, I think the path that you describing all of that path that took also kind of points back to, again, the problem is the sources that we need to make these communities better. I feel like, that's where, yes, I feel like that is the vector, that is the lever. We've talked multiple times about levers of action, and I feel like that is where it is at. It's how can we improve the quality of life in these communities where these people are, almost in a lot of cases funneled down paths of crime or paths of just not being able to escape that. And I feel like that is more so. And it's tough because I don't know. I don't have specifics of how to address that because I don't understand the problem enough. Okay, please tell me so I'm not rambling here.
I do. I think
Yeah.
there has to be some government intervention. I don't think that private firms are going to be the ones to address this problem. They really can't. If I would say so. Um, part of why I say that is they don't have a strong incentive to do so, and they're about making profit, right? That's sort of why they're constituted. And if we look at history, we didn't talk about history at all, but for those who are interested in history, the book also covers some history of the U.S., particularly in the 60s, to look at when during the administrations of John F. Kennedy and a little bit of President Johnson. I also look at Reagan as well, but sort of when change sort of happened a little bit that involved companies, we had the government's involvement as well. And so that really is kind of necessary. Now, the current administration is unlikely to do that, and that's important to say. But there is potentially a future government that will be much more plugged in. It could also be state governments. It doesn't have to be the federal government. For those who are more interested in stronger state power and less with this sort of national government. Either way, some government entity that can step in to address either what companies are doing or just this broader problem, societal, institutional, deep-seated opportunity problems is absolutely necessary.
Yeah, I think it's really, again, if you can, I am, I recently had a gentleman on here, Dr. John Graham, who he works to rehabilitate former prisoners after they come out of prison. And his term is using hand ups, not handouts. And I think that's very poignant here in the sense that I still, no, I don't think, I think injecting money into the community through the sense of programs, like you talked about, organizations coming in or entities coming in and putting, better sports programs, better after school programs, trying to bring families together so that people aren't coming from broken homes and have positive role models in their life, as opposed to, some people have talked about, like, okay, we just give us a paycheck. I don't think that's the solution. I think the former is better there. Have you thought more down those lines? And is that when you were talking about some of JFK's term and President Johnson's and President Reagan's terms, were those programs embedded in the communities at that time?
Yeah, so first I would say the reason why these communities, there all these problems is because the country itself, its laws, its institutions has put them there. We can go as far back as slavery, sort of setting these people up for failure, essentially. If you, from the time of slavery, you remove the father from the home and you're supposed to have a situation where people are successful, and you have Jim Crow laws mostly in the South, but also in the Northeast and elsewhere, sort of preventing people from opportunity. You have the burning of successful Black businesses and all of. I mean, so I can go on and on about why we even had the problem. Once you recognize that the government itself is part of the problem, right? It's not like, oh, these are to help them. It's to correct the problem that the government and, basically including private entities, but mostly the government set up before. Then you think about it differently because it's a correction, not necessarily a giving people something, right? And the programs in the 60s, I mean, there were a few of them, but there was the Johnson's War on Poverty, which was I'm not even sure it was a war at all, but essentially it's, let's try to help these communities and have these nonprofits help them, and the private sector was also involved in terms of hiring people, etc. um Sure, it may have made a little bit of a difference, but it actually, and the book goes into why that ultimately was actually not necessarily good for racial minorities. There was some other historical things that happened at the time that it didn't quite reach the people it should have. Also because it got targeted much more broadly than when we had something prior to that, which was called the Plans for Progress program, which was targeted towards racial minorities. We don't have time to go through all of this stuff, but
Mhm.
read the book, read the history chapter, and you get a sense
Yes.
of what I'm talking about too. But those programs helped, and you had the government, the federal government, the national government actually setting up some of this stuff. Um, we don't necessarily have something equivalent to that anymore.
Mhm.
But that's also because there are so many other institutions now that are trying to get at that, and they receive government funding. So, like, the government would fund these nonprofits, for example, and then those are supposed to be dispersed out to the communities. President Biden actually tried to expand this when he came into office with the sort of environmental justice programs where you have the nonprofits get federal funding and then disperse it. All of those have been canceled now, but that would have been another way to think about how the national government can have some process in place to sort of get some of these uh, funding that could create better opportunities out.
Yeah. Do you know, have you done any digging into any of these nonprofits and know of any that are doing, seem to be above board and are doing big things?
There's so many of them. I mean, they mostly are not getting federal funding, so they're
Okay.
funded by philanthropy, right? So basically, corporations, private foundations, for example, and there are quite a bit of them. It's just there's a limit to what private foundations can fund,
Yeah.
and most of the money is like, there's some that's like restricted and what they couldn't do with their funds. Also, you can imagine it's hard to address a system when you're just kind of focused on one area or one issue. So that's also limited.
Yeah, it's hard. It is so freaking complex. Like it is just, I mean, uh, if you had the wand to wave here to start getting the ball rolling, where would you start?
On the problem that Disclosureland starts, I would, and the book, urges and kind of looks at what different groups can do today, right? You don't have to, we don't have to wait for the government to change, although that's also helpful. But if you're a consumer, if you're an employee of a company, if you are a shareholder, if you are even the media, there are specific things you can do to try to put some accountability structures in place so that companies can just like, you know, throw out words and take them back and do whatever they want. And all of it, whatever works for them, right? That's essentially what it is. Like whatever helps their reputation is what they're doing, regardless of how it might impact the issues that they claim that they're working on.
Yeah. And, I thought about this a lot. And, we've had 2 months here probably since we got you booked to come on the show. And like, I think you already said it, or I know you said it. I don't know if this is like your total view here, but I really thought it was like, should it be the responsibility of these companies to do this? And I don't think it is, as with the asterisk of, like you said, if you're not making the statements in the first place. If you're going to make the statements, I think you should have to follow through. But in terms of making these changes, I think it's at a different level, right? And these are businesses. It is a societal level to address these issues. But what are
Yeah.
your thoughts?
I think companies are also responsible on some level because they are part of the problem, honestly. There are in fact equity issues in businesses, and they should tackle that. And ultimately companies are benefiting from society in all the ways. And they too should be responsible, although I don't think they should be solely responsible for any of this, right? I think the government should be a big part of that as well. Um, and so, you know, those are part of the sort of thought process. We should all think about this, right? Um, I one cannot say, they should be ultimately responsible. And I'm not advocating for mandatory, you know, like statements or anything like that. But if you do make the statements, there should be some accountability.
Yeah, it's a great point. And I don't think anyone can really argue with that. I mean, that is a very sensible, reasonable, stance to take on it. Uh, have I missed anything that you would like to cover before we start to wrap this thing up?
Oh, this has been very expensive. I mean, it's been enjoyable, and it's been so great to have this conversation with you because we also disagree on some points, but it's good to be able to see common ground or think about, how some of our thoughts around these issues don't intersect. And I wish there would be more conversations like this among people who may disagree about certain topics, charged topics in today's society.
Yeah, and where you can actually talk and there's no jumping down each other's throats. And I mean, this is, I think I would like to think there's more of these conversations happening than we realize, and that it is more so we think they're not because of the way media portrays it and the way that social media algorithms present certain
Yeah,
things to us.
I hope so. I do.
Yeah.
I hope so, Zach.
So where can everyone find your work and keep up to date with everything that you're doing moving forward?
I would encourage you to go to my website, Atinuke Adediran .com or tinuadediran.com. Either way, that's where you find information on the book, where to order it. Also, my other research, my media appearances, and op-eds and all the other stuff that you might be interested in as well.
Awesome. I seriously, I enjoyed this very, very much. I was nervous to do it because it was around race, and I try and stay away from, this isn't politics, but I try and stay away from, I don't, I guess that's not, I try and stay away from politics for sure, but this is, I guess, the first more charged, as you said, topic that I've discussed on here. And I was sweating coming into it. So I just appreciate you again being open and just having the conversation with me, like you said. So and I meant it when I said you're a great communicator. This was awesome. So thank you so much for taking the time. And everyone, please go check out Tinu's book. Thank you, Tinu.
Thank you for, being interested in this, even though you've never done anything like this. I'm really, when I saw that you got the invitation from you, I too was like, this is interesting. But I think we should have conversations across differences. Yes, race has become charged in a way that it really shouldn't be because it's people's identities. Like we're all race, whether you're white or black, race is part of who we are in this country, at least. And so we can't really escape it, right? But it's become this sort of polarized issue. And so, thanks for being brave, I would say, in having this conversation with me.
Well, you too, apparently. So thank you. And thank you everyone for listening to another episode of Going In Blind. This was a charged one, as we've just said 3 times in the past minute. But hopefully you've gotten something out of it. I know I did. Please, please go check out Tinu's website. I will have it linked in the show notes below. Go buy her book. Listen to this a couple times because I think there was quite a bit to go pick back through. But thank you again for listening, and I will see you next time. Bye.